Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. Welcome back. We took the 4th of July weekend off, so it is good to be back on the air now. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical, and this week my guest is Andy Ellis of the Green Party of Maryland. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Andy. This is the first time you've been on the show.
Thanks, Chris. I'm excited to be here. As Chris said, I'm Andy Ellis. I'm a Baltimore City Green Party Steering Committee member, and I've been in and out of different roles with the Maryland Green Party and the Green Party of the United States. I've been really active in this work since about 2015, when I stepped up to help a friend who was running for city council here in Baltimore. And then I got more and more involved in the inner workings of the party. And I'm considering in 2026 running for governor as a Green Party candidate here in Maryland. And I'm excited to talk about what has been the past, what is coming in the future, and the prospects for the Green Party right now. It's an interesting time for the Green Party, a lot of attention on us, and I think that's great opportunity for this conversation today.
Yeah, there is quite a lot of attention, maybe even a little more than usual. I know that Cornel West has, after some weird missteps, said he's running for the Green nomination.
Yeah.
That's big news, and I know that even MSNBC and The Nation have had words about that, even if I don't necessarily like the way they chose to frame it.
Yeah, it is big news. You know, it is the most prominent person, I think, to consider a left independent green race certainly since Ralph Nader. And I think that gives us an opportunity to talk about the state of green politics, what the campaign looks like, and the candidate. And you know, it is bringing attention to the party in a way that I think very little else has on a nationalized whole big media stage. I think there's been small places and cities and towns and in states where Greens have gotten some good attention, but this kind of national attention and national media focus on it, I think is going to set up a really, really interesting next 18 months or so.
No, I think it is, and that's going to be a definitely make the election cycle more interesting, especially if Cornel West is prominent enough to get a little more media attention than an MSNBC spot the day before the presidential election, like they gave Howie Hawkins.
Yeah.
Though I was impressed, and I don't want to make it sound like I'm talking too good about mainstream media here, because I totally understand that it was still the morning before the election at the very last minute. But when's the last time you've actually seen a Green Party presidential candidate on cable news? I think that was the first time I'd ever seen it.
I think CNN did a town hall with Jill Stein in 2016.
Did they? Okay, that's interesting. But still,
yeah. I mean, I think that I think Ralph Nader was so prominent in 2000. I think people forget how big the Ralph Nader campaign was, and that it was having rallies around the country, and that
it was huge. I mean, let's go ahead and start there, because younger Greens, or even younger political left-leaning independents or progressive Democrats who weren't voting in 2000 may not understand this the way people my age do. So I'm glad you brought this up.
Yeah.
Folks, in 2000, they were able to quote unquote blame Ralph Nader because of the whole disputed mess in Florida. Somebody was able to dig up the fact that Ralph Nader snagged enough votes that if all those votes had gone to Al Gore, he would have won Florida, and that would have been that. And, you know, that ignores the whole fact that the Republicans had this Supreme Court, had this ridiculous court challenge ready, and had Jeb Bush's help to fix the elections. And when you look at it that way, the Democrats, this is something we all have to remember, the Democrats would rather blame the Green Party for their own failings than admit that they were the victim of a Republican conspiracy. even when they use that Republican conspiracy to try to gain electoral points off a stolen election in 2004 and 2008.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And, you know, I mean, I think that this Ralph Nader spoiled the election in 2000, and the newer version of it, Jill Stein spoiled the election in 2016. I think this talking point is one that Democrats, their media networks, and their consultants have honed over years and years and years, and they use it very well. They got their money worth. Whatever they paid some consultant to come up with this talking point, it has endured. It has done really well.
I hate to cut you off, but I mean,
Yeah.
Let's take, though, just on the objective facts, let's take the Ralph Nader and the Jill Stein accusations and look at them side by side.
Yeah.
In 2000, you've got sort of a legitimate argument for this because of the vote count in Florida. In 2016, Jill Stein gets less votes than the Libertarian Party. So why aren't they blaming Gary Johnson for Hillary Clinton's loss?
Right. Or in New Hampshire, where Maggie Hassan, I believe, won the Senate seat that time, and Jill Stein's voters had more of a percentage of the voters in the presidential race than Hassan beat the Republican by. That probably means that a Democratic Senate seat was there, because if we believe in this transitive theory of votes, right? Like, it gets really complicated at the point that we start looking into it and seeing what actually happens there. I think my point, though, is that the Democratic Party has extracted this conversation out of the Greens year after year after year. And like when David Axelrod the other day sent a tweet out, and almost the entirety of the online left spent the next 2 days talking about it. I think we have to be careful about getting sucked into this debate, because as much as we might be right on the facts of it, and as much as it's important to dispute their propaganda about it, it is the way the Democrats have defined the Green Party, and many in the Green Party have defined themselves for the last 20 years. And I think I love to get into the details of it, but I also think that as a party, we need to be careful about letting that be how we get defined by them or by ourselves.
Well, no, and because it's a dishonest definition.
Yep.
I mentioned The Nation talking about the Cornel West candidacy. Joan Walsh, in her article in The Nation, covered all of the facts that give me pause about a Cornel West candidacy fairly well. But her point wasn't whether or not Cornel West would be a good candidate for president, or whether or not Cornel West is someone that progressives and leftists and socialists, which, let's remember, that is in theory the audience The Nation is aiming for, progressives and leftists and socialists. The Nation was founded to be the, quote, journal of the American left, unquote, during the civil rights era. It's worth noting that her focus is that it's bad for Cornel West to run for president because that would reelect Trump. That same tired trope.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know. I guess I feel a little bit differently about this trope. I think we underestimate the power that it has and the way that it has undercut green organizing over the last 20 years. I almost think that in a world, like, the counterfactual that I like to consider is, what if Ralph Nader had done just a little less well in some of those states? How much better off would the party be without having that debate over the last 20 years over and over and over again? Because I think it's worked pretty well. I mean, when I'm out talking to regular voters, not just knocking on green doors or something, I think there's three things that people tend to know about the Greens if they know anything about them.
Yeah.
One is, you all are environmentalists, and maybe you all like legal weed. Like, maybe those two are tied together. Two is, you all spoiled the election for Ralph Nader and Jill Stein's elections. And three is, you only come out every 4 years. And I think we actually have to think about how effective those messagings have been by the Democratic Party over the last 20 years. You know, so
in my personal history in California, And this is a fairly significant knock. And I will note that this changed after I moved out of California. I began observing big differences in long-term investments, and things really took a move in a positive direction, which I believe is why there's a Green Party mayor of Baldwin Park now. I believe it's a big part, even though he didn't run as a Green, he ran as an independent. When he ran for Congress, he ran as a Green. And I think it's a big part of why Kenneth Mejia was elected city controller in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Or is it comptroller? I can never remember whether Los Angeles has a controller or a comptroller, but I guess it doesn't really matter. It means the same thing in the end.
Yeah, no, I think it is, and I just, I think I guess my point on this is it's important to have these debates. It's important to set the record straight. But David Axelrod knew that he could extract conversation out of the Green left for days and days and days on an argument that he knows works pretty well for his side of this, right?
Well, it worked so well that there was a group that people were calling demo Greens in 2004 and 2008, whose whole point was try to stop their candidate from ruining things for John Kerry.
Yeah, and I mean, look, I think I've been public about this. My position right now is that I'm supporting none of the above in the Green presidential race. We have that choice, and I'm going to take it until I see a candidate that has been vetted and that is qualified, until I see a campaign that can deliver on that candidate's promises, until I see a party that can back the two of them up. And if I don't see those things, I think that we are playing a high risk, low reward game with presidential campaigns right now. And that being said, Cornel West is the most exciting Green presidential candidate I've seen.
Yes.
So if he can meet those criteria, and I think that the party can grow off of it and can build movements off of it and can transform things on the ground off of it, I'll be excited, and I'll probably end up supporting it.
Let's shift to Cornel West now, because this is actually a better and more interesting conversation than the Ralph Nader and Jill Stein accusations in 2000 and 2020 anyway.
Yep.
Now, I want to start by saying I have a lot of respect for Dr. Cornel West. There are a lot of liberal academics who speak up on issues, but there are not a lot of liberal academics who have the courage of their convictions to take the consequences of their actions. And Dr. Cornel West was willing to stand up for Palestinian rights at a time when it lost him his chance to get tenured at Harvard University.
Yep. And
that I have a lot of respect for that. I have issues with his we have to stop Trump endorsements of Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden in 2016 and 2020. It makes me wonder about his candidacy in 2024. Is there going to be a point where he's going to tell Green Party voters, well, we have to stop Trump now, folks?
Yeah. I mean, I have a lot of questions about it. So, my first interaction with Cornel West was when he and Bell Hooks wrote Breaking Bread in the mid-'90s. And I read it while I was coaching debate. I thought it was amazing. And since then, I've paid very close attention to him. And I understand the intellectual trajectory that he's making. I appreciate his project. I appreciate his politics. And I have a lot of concerns about this campaign at this point. I don't know that it doesn't feel well planned to me. It feels like it's well planned in somebody's head, maybe, but not.
Well, he says. Let's talk about who planned it. Whose idea was this?
Yeah.
Dr. Cornel West himself says that he ran for president because a gentleman named Nick Branagh asked him to.
Yep.
For those people who don't know it, if you're watching my show, you probably know who he is, for which I apologize. If you're watching my show for the first time and you haven't heard it before, Nick Branagh is the self-appointed czar of a group that calls itself the Movement for a People's Party, and apparently now is claiming to be the People's Party. And he started out as an intern on a Bernie campaign in 2016. He was misrepresented by accident in some campaign literature as a national outreach coordinator because whoever was writing that campaign press release confused two Nicks with each other. And that's never been properly corrected. And he's been making a sort of a weird career in the shadows of the internet ever since then. And people like Jimmy Dore and Chris Hedges and Jill Stein and Dr. Cornel West and a surprising number of others appear to think Nick Brenna is a serious person doing good work. And yet most of his actual work appears to be outreach to the worst people in the Libertarian Party and the squirrely side of what I would call the reactionary left, the people who identify themselves very seriously as Stalinists. Well, I won't say that they identify as Stalinists. They identify themselves as Marxist, Leninists, and social conservatives in a way that is tremendously reminiscent of a Stalinist party in the UK called the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, which goes so far as to conduct voter outreach with the Tories and the people to the right of the Tories, as opposed to with actual communist groups. And those are the people who have all been around this Cornel West candidacy. He ran because Nick Brenna asked him to. And it's Chris Hedges and Jill Stein who have been very active in recruiting him to run for the Green nomination too.
Yeah, so a couple things. So first off, I think that let's talk about People's Party for a second first. So I think that the People's Party is really interesting because I think they're making this move, which I think basically takes the universalist policies from the left, offers them to the right, and does it while offering the bargain that you don't have to deal with those woke folks on the left. And so we're going to end up with Medicare for all for white folks, and we're going to end up with free college for white folks, and we're going to end up with they're going to take anti-war. Go ahead.
Small quibble. We're going to end up with Medicare for all for white men, and we're going to end up with free college for straight white men.
Yeah.
And I should have put straight white men in on the first one too, because
fair enough.
These parts matter. These little details matter, especially. I know that there was a dispute in 2020 between more accepting and social justice oriented Greens and TERFs in Maryland at one point.
Sure. Well,
and so that's the sort of thing that makes me worry a little bit. Are we seeing those people look to take a trip back to the top of the Green Party all over again on this Cornel West campaign?
Totally. And I think Cornel West poses an interesting challenge to it because Cornel West is an anti-racist, anti-oppression thinker in most contexts. So it
most contexts.
Yeah, I mean, anybody who's
this is where I bring up what worries me the most right now, because I don't know if you know about it or not. Cornel West is a member of a corporate academic advisory board.
Yep.
The corporate academic advisory board is for a company that manufactures a standardized college admissions test called the Classics Learning Test. The CEO of this corporation is a Nick Fuentes Catholic. It's very important that you understand this tendency in Catholicism, because six of the Supreme Court justices are this kind of Catholic. The one won't admit it. And there's a whole different story there. Seriously, I would love to see a conspiracy theory show do a show on whether Neil Gorsuch is or is not a Catholic. But that gets into the weird weeds, and we're not 18th century British Whigs anymore.
So I think what my conclusion on this is if we need a Green Party that is going to work to represent the left, whatever we consider the left to be, but the real left, it can't throw social justice under the bus. It can't say we're willing to work with the transphobes, we're willing to work with the racists, we're willing to work with whatever dedicated group of folks it is.
This is my concern about Dr. West. I understand that he's a social justice thinker. Yes. Yeah. I understand that that's the perception. I understand that that's the history.
And I think there's a tendency, especially amongst white Greens, to think that the woke left is stopping them from getting material gains that they agree with. And I think that there's a possibility that they would say, hey, we would compromise on racial justice if we could end war, fight the banks, fight the corporations, and get Medicare for all. And I think that tendency is really, really dangerous right now, because I think Trump and Bannon are trying to harness that tendency in order to have a political realignment that takes those material policies of the left and uses them in application of a white ethno state.
That's why Trump was running for the Republican nomination on I won't cancel your Social Security in 2016.
Right.
It's why he's running for the Republican nomination now in 2024, even though it's not 2024 yet. It's really stupid for people like Rick Scott to want to cancel everybody's Social Security.
Yeah.
And you got to give Trump credit for that.
He's not enough of a conservative that he actually cares about that stuff, right? He cares about America First white ethno-nationalism, I think. Yeah. And I think he and Bannon are willing to look and say, look, we could realign this whole game right now. And I worry that folks like the People's Party, folks like Jimmy Dore, and some of those folks are either wittingly or unwittingly playing into that. And it's a tendency I've seen for several years. There's a National Justice Party out right now that has a platform very similar to the White Workers' Party that Matthew Heimbach used to have. Yes. And it is anti-corporate, it is anti-war, it is Medicare for all, it is free college, and it is pro-whiteness as de jure law. And I think that the folks on the left need to be really careful about these solutions being taken from us and repackaged by offering that you don't have to be woke over here. And I think that the liberal left has made a mistake of stripping the materiality out of much of the criticism of race and gender and all of those things. The Clintons, if you look at the progression of the Democratic Party from 1968 to the Clintons in 1992, you have a materially centered Democratic Party in 1968 trying to use government in order to shift things in the right way. And then the Clintons say, we want to appeal to these professionals. We want to be third way in neoliberalism.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'm going to hand you the Green Party strategy for 2026. And you can do with it what you will. Yeah, but this is what I would tell people if I were running for office as a Green or a socialist or PSL or any third party out there in any state that might have ballot access anywhere, because it's important to remember. In 1972, Joe Biden ran for Senate. Now, it's important to set aside who Joe Biden was before he ran for Senate, because that gave people sort of a false idea of what he was going to be like when he was in the Senate. And instead to focus on who he was before he got into politics and who he was when he ran for the Senate. So Joe Biden is a good case study in how the Democratic Party changed. He has the superficial appearance of class-oriented politics in that he is his father ascended from the working class to the petty bourgeois and went from being a guy who worked around the city to a guy who owned a used car dealership and could give his son a Corvette for his 18th birthday.
Right. Class as identity instead of as materiality.
Yes.
Right.
And you see this in Joe Biden's career. Working class Joe has been a thing all his career. and yet his actual career has not been very good for the working class.
Mm-hmm.
But that's because working class Joe actually isn't working class. His father was one of the last people in the white working class in America to experience social mobility. And his father went from being working class to being a boss.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he may have been a small boss, but he was still a boss. He owned a used car dealership. He parlayed it into a couple more used car dealerships. He left his son some money. The reason Joe Biden was the first child in his working class family to go to college is because he was the first family and the first child in his working class family to have the money to go to college. His father helped make that happen. Joe Biden is a creation of his father's social mobility. And he's a great example of America's false consciousness, a petty bourgeois boss passing himself off as a working class dude. And with that in mind, it's important to understand the politics of Delaware in 1972. Delaware in 1972 had a liberal Republican governor who had beaten a Dixiecrat who was more conservative than the current liberal Republican governor of Delaware in 1972. And he had beaten said Dixiecrat with Joe Biden's support when Joe Biden was still a public defender and not yet a politician. Supporting a pro-civil rights Republican against an anti-civil rights Democrat for governor was how Joe Biden first put himself on the Delaware political map. He then became a Democrat to run for a county supervisor seat and was a pretty solid liberal in that county supervisor seat with really good ideas like, let's move the housing projects to the suburbs because if black folks live in the suburbs alongside white people, we can integrate our schools without having to bus anyone, which sounded like a great idea, but it never actually passed, though they did pass mandatory busing with Joe Biden's specific support. Then you have Joe Biden running for Senate in 1972. The man who was sitting in that seat was a man named J. Caleb Boggs, who was colloquially known in Washington and the media at the time as Cale Boggs. Cale Boggs was one of the great Rockefeller Republicans of the Civil Rights era. He voted for both Civil Rights Acts. He voted for Medicare and for Medicare and for Lyndon Johnson's expansion of Social Security. That was the last major expansion of Social Security in our history, that had extended it to a lot of the people that FDR had left out in the first round. He was the co-sponsor of the original Clean Water Act that eventually became the EPA legislation. And if you look at the water in Delaware now versus the water in Delaware in 1972, you really realize that Delaware has gone totally off the Cale Boggs agenda.
Uh-huh.
He was pro-civil rights. He was pro-environment. He was more pro-working class than the majority of either Republicans or Democrats in the Senate. He was one of your old style political generational dynasty politicians, but he was a liberal who had stayed in office by playing the liberal game of helping people out when it'll help you out. He was good for civil rights. He was good for the minimum wage. He was good for environmental protection. And Joe Biden ran against him from the right. Joe Biden ran against him saying, hey, aren't there too many black people in your kids' schools? Isn't there a lot of crime, even though we've had all this civil rights that was supposed to make it better? And Joe Biden beat Cale Boggs, took his Senate seat. And what happened in 1973 in Joe Biden's first year in the Senate? They they made mandatory busing a federal crime. So Joe Biden in 1973, after winning election in 1972 against a pro-civil rights Republican, signs on to one of the most anti-civil rights legislative acts of the modern era.
And covers up that
example because Biden is president, but it's only one example.
Hold on real quick. He covers up that time period and his politics in that time period with identity stories. With I was riding the train because my wife and kids and all of that is tragedy. And I don't mean to minimize it, but he is making that move of obscuring materiality with identity stories that has become the hallmark of the modern Democratic Party.
And this is also, the 70s is also where we see the labor movement transition from strikes and labor actions to civil rights style sit-ins and protests and sing-alongs. And it really, all that stuff made sense for civil rights. But when you're doing a labor action, you kind of have to, if you're still working, it doesn't matter if you're doing a sit-in and a sing-along.
Right.
And it's important to think about some of these changes of tactics that happened around the same time when the liberalized labor movement became an institution of the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
And so 6 years later in 1978, Paul Tsongas, who people who remember the 92 election when Clinton won might remember from the primary, Paul Tsongas ran against Edward Brooke. Now, if you don't know who Edward Brooke is, folks, I am sorry, because in the history of the 60s and the 70s, Edward Brooke is important. Edward Brooke was the first black senator since Reconstruction. He was a liberal Republican from Massachusetts. He was tremendously important for all of the signature legislation of the LBJ era and that last spate of liberal, really strong liberal legislation in the Nixon era. His importance to American liberalism as a reform movement is tremendous. A lot of the legislative successes of that period come down to Edward Brooke. We talk about Cale Boggs co-sponsoring the original clean water legislation that became the APA. Well, Edward Brooke co-sponsored the 1968 Civil Rights Act and wrote the Fair Housing Act. So Paul Tsongas runs against him. And more importantly, this doesn't get talked about enough. This is part of the undemocratic part of the Democratic Party. Ed Brooke had a divorce a couple of years before the 1978 election, big public divorce. A county prosecutor in Ed Brooke's home county decided to launch a criminal investigation into Ed Brooke's divorce. Who ever heard about that? A criminal investigation into a politician's divorce? How often does that happen?
Right.
And when it's carried out by the opposing party, because obviously this guy was a Democrat. We're doing this during the Senate election. Now, here's the fun part. What was the name of this county prosecutor in Massachusetts who ran a criminal investigation into Edward Brooke's divorce while Paul was challenging for a Senate seat?
Is it another Greek?
It's not another Greek.
Okay.
In fact, it is an Irishman.
Okay.
A fairly famous Irishman in the context of the 60s and 70s as well, and not someone who you would necessarily think of as a reactionary enemy of liberal reform either, at least not then.
Who was it?
John Kerry.
Okay.
War protester John Kerry.
I wasn't sure which.
War protester John Kerry, just a few years removed from dressing like a hippie and testifying to Congress on how bad the Vietnam War really was.
Yeah, I wasn't sure which Massachusetts Democrat that we all got to know it was going to
be. But no, this is what's really interesting. This is long-haired, radical, anti-war protester John Kerry opening a criminal investigation into Edward Brooke's divorce in order to help a right-wing neoconservative win a Senate seat as a Democrat.
Yeah.
And really undoing a whole lot of the things that John Kerry stood for as an activist, in order to play the political game with his new Democratic Party friends. Well, not new. John Kerry came from that kind of family, which is why he was a naval officer in the first place. But that's a whole different story too. But that's the system. Political dirty tricks by someone seen as a liberal hero to support against a liberal Republican and a black man, and to support a very racially charged law and order campaign.
Yeah, and you know,
this is who the Democrats are. This is how the Democrats became the party of the big legislative party of the 80s and 90s by recovering from their losses in the 1970. Well, their apparent losses in the 1972 presidential election with the strategy that won them Congress and the Senate, which was run a bunch of conservatives on anti-war platforms and then let them show their real face once they're in Congress.
You know, and I think that this is useful context for a time we face in which there are more and more political parties stepping up to be the multi-party challenger. So I think there was a time in which the Green Party was the left party, the Libertarian or the Reform Party or whatever it was sort of the right party. But I think that as we've gotten further and further into the 2020s and the 2010s, and more people are falling out of the party system, I think we're going to start to see conservatives using liberal universal solutions in order to be able to garner outside share of the independent vote and outside share of some Republican votes and things like that. And I think that I love this historical context because I think that in every place, so one of the risks of nationalizing elections for Greens and for everybody else is that we are just talking in generalities when people who have been there and lived it know these stories, and those generalities can't explain away what happened in Massachusetts in the 60s and 70s to people who were in Massachusetts in the 60s and 70s. And likewise in Maryland, we've had a Democrat majority control both houses of the legislature with a veto-proof majority for almost a decade. I'm sorry, not a decade, almost a century. Decade is easy. Almost a century. And it's an oddly conservative state that can do some big liberal things. And I think that
in 1923, the Maryland Democrats who established that 100-year control were conservative white guys who hated labor.
Right. Isn't it fascinating that when the big switch happened in the parties, Maryland did not switch who was in control of the legislature?
Well, that's the whole funny part of the big switch. So the nature of the big switch, which appeared to be the goal of which was originally to get rid of the Dixiecrats, sort of blew up in the faces of the people behind the strategy of realignment.
Right.
This is history I haven't talked about on the show for a while. Realignment is something that's also good for people to know about if they don't know about it. During the 1940s and 1950s, the left in America was a collection of third-party movements, mostly represented by the Communist Party of the United States and the Socialist Party of America. The Communist Party of the United States had all sorts of Cold War baggage that caused it problems, but had a reasonable amount of influence, at least in the 20s and 30s, in the labor movement. Whereas the Socialist Party of America had built the American labor movement and built the socialist movement in America in a lot of ways, and was sort of seeing itself eclipsed both by the Communist Party and by New Deal Democrats in the 20s and 30s. And then after World War II, with the Cold War and everything switched all around, a group of people in the Socialist Party, the names that people would recognize the most are Max Schachtman, who was the last leader of the Socialist Party, the old Socialist Party of America as an independent party. Bayard Rustin, who was RFK Senior, Junior confused me. RFK Senior's campaign manager in 1968, and the founder of Social Democrats of the United States, and Michael Harrington, who left Social Democrats of the United States to found the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee because of disagreements with the Social Democrats over the Vietnam War. SDUSA was very, very hawkish and anti-communist on Vietnam, publicly pro-war. Michael Harrington was quietly pro-U.S. State Department, but publicly he wanted to work with the peace movement to organize for the future. And so he tended to, despite quiet support for the State Department and steering things in pro-American directions in general, he spoke out on the Vietnam War, took an anti-war line, and generally supported the peace movement publicly while not really opposing the war. And all of this stuff during the 60s was really the focus of finding candidates who would support the civil rights movement, with the idea that by orienting the Democratic Party around the civil rights movement, they would be orienting the Democratic Party around a true working class, multicultural, socialist path to the future. And all those horrible reactionaries would be thrown out into the Republican Party. What actually happened, though, is yes, realignment briefly changed this perception. The Democrats became a liberal party, but the great era of Democratic Party liberal reform was only possible because of the legislative alliance between Hubert Humphrey liberal Democrats and Nelson Rockefeller liberal Republicans. Mm-hmm. And after the 70s, you see the Democrats take power in the old pre-war North by attacking all the liberal Republicans from the right.
Yep.
And you see the Republicans take power in the old pre-war South by attacking the Democrats from the right. And it's really the victory of the Dixiecrats in North and South. In the North, the Dixiecrats won by taking over the Democratic Party and attacking right. And in the South, the Dixiecrats won by going to the Republican Party and attacking right with the Southern strategy.
Right. And you know, like realignments are an essential thing for us to talk about, especially as a third party or as a small party outside of the so-called two-party system. There has to be a realignment for us to be able to have a constituency which we can utilize between elections in order to have the power to change outcomes. And if there's not a real, and sometimes I think that, like, one of the criticisms that I've had of the Green Party since I've been involved is that there is not enough of a historical grounding or a power analysis. And we need to understand what it would actually take to not just give voters choices, but to influence the outcomes that we believe in and to implement our solutions. And I think we need to think about what the constituency making would look like in order to have that kind of realignment today that would be both anti-racist, anti-oppression, anti-sexist, and constructively building new systems. And I think it's hard. It's hard. The reason that we haven't had this conversation much as a party is because it's harder than just opposing the Democrats or just.
Well, and this is where you get into the hard work of organizing,
right?
And not just organizing, for a campaign, but actually organizing between elections.
Yes.
One of the most important stories for the history of politics in America, at least modern politics recently, is in the 1980s, there was a little Democratic Socialist Party in Vermont. They still exist now.
Yeah.
Called the Liberty Union.
Yeah. I got arrested in Bernie's office with Will Miller protesting the Kosovo War. And Will and I talked a whole bunch about the Vermont Liberty Union Party at the time. And we talked about Bernie's opposition to the Liberty Union Party after he had been part of it in the beginning.
And Bernie's reason for leaving and running as an independent was they're not doing anything between elections.
Right. And Will Miller, who was foundational to the.
Their actual ideology is better than Bernie's. I totally agree. They're right to be mad at Bernie for betraying them. Yep. However, they should have been doing something between elections. Look what Bernie was able to do by doing stuff between elections.
Totally. And I think the question is, what is that stuff that we do between elections? Because the parties do stuff, but it's just not the right stuff, I think, in a lot of cases. So let me talk a little bit about what I'm planning on doing as part of the lead up to the 2026 election here. So there are 7,500 registered Greens in Maryland as of the time that we lost our ballot status. I think it's down to 7,000 now. And there's 5,000 folks who have been Greens or left over the last since 2016. So over the next 18 months, our campaign is reaching out to every one of those 12,500 people in order to try to understand why they joined the Green Party. After all, it's an active choice. Joining the Green Party isn't something that you get sorted into by the state. You choose to join. So we want to understand what they joined, what they want out of the party, what their political priorities are, and if they left, why they left. And we're going to use that as also a means of identifying organizers, of identifying candidates, and of identifying people who want to contribute to the larger political program. Now, one of the reasons that I wanted to start early, and one of my concerns about the Cornel West campaign and the party in general, is that we start at the end of the process and hope it works, as opposed to starting at the beginning. I wouldn't have time if I started in 2025 or 2026 to do that base building work and that organizing work and that outreach work. But by starting early and knowing very clearly what role it plays in the strategy, I can. And I think it's unfortunate that we have gotten to a place as a party where candidates and campaigns have to do that base building work because the party hasn't been doing so. But I think it is the situation that we're in right now, is that candidates have to do it in order to help invigorate the party to be able to do it.
I had an interesting conversation on Twitter with a former member of the National Committee, Garrett Wasserman, about some of the perceived unfairness of the Hawkins candidacy in 2020. And one of the big things that created the biggest presentation of unfairness is that Howie Hawkins was working from the beginning on a national voter outreach program before the party was. And when the national party sort of started working on voter outreach, the Hawkins machine was what was there to do the outreach.
Right.
And so once you have one candidate who's doing voter outreach on such a level that they become the party's voter outreach, and when that candidate has a strategy that includes getting the nomination of the new Socialist Party of America and advertising a red-green alliance to try to make to really whip up a bandwagon for his campaign, he's going to have real structural advantages over the other candidates, which then raises the question, yes, unfairness happened because of this trajectory. So why were other candidates not looking into voter outreach the same way as Howie Hawkins before they decided to run?
So let me talk about that a little bit, because I was on the presidential campaign support committee there, and I also had more than a few conversations with Howie because he was friends with Kevin Zeese and Margaret Flowers, and they're big allies of mine within the Green Party. So I think Howie had a good strategy. I think he had a good plan, and I think he understood that politics involves organizing and talking to people. Yes. I do think that there were some places, both in the Hawkins campaign and the Dario Hunter campaign, where Greens had too many hats on and were sitting on committees that they shouldn't have been able to sit on, and directing party resources. And, you can say that you put that firewall up, but the perception is there and the reality is there. And, I think it's one thing to have party supporters in positions or to have campaign supporters in positions of power, but people on the payroll in positions of power gives a perception of
if your campaign manager is the chair of a state party, then that automatically raises questions about the nominating process in that state party.
Right. And some of this, in the past, I think there has been a tendency of the party to say, well, that's just how it is. We don't have many volunteers.
Exactly.
And it's because we haven't taken the time to build up the party infrastructure so that there can be enough people to run the party while the people who need to go out and campaign are campaigning. And I think we're trying to take efforts at that to address that in Maryland right now. We just passed a new set of bylaws in our state party that I think help democratize the party, that define clearly who a member is and what their responsibilities are. We also passed a code of conduct, which I think holds people accountable, holds people in power accountable for conflicts of interest, that holds people in power accountable for saying awful things to each other. And it also holds people accountable for doing awful things like filing paperwork that they shouldn't be allowed to file. You know, and so I think my lesson from that in 2020 is how we did a ton of things right. But
Yes.
if the party had been built up and had the party infrastructure so that his campaign manager could have stepped away from her other roles and focused on the campaign, the party would have done better and the campaign would have done better.
There's a conspiracy theory out there that the Cornel West candidacy is Nick Brana trying to take over the Green Party. Now, I don't know if I would go that far. However, I will say that, as you have just laid out, the function, the way the Green Party functions means it's really easy for a candidate with an active and well planned out campaign infrastructure to successfully take over the Green Party, at least for the duration of an election.
I'm not sure what takeover means.
Well, let's put it this way. Simple and straightforward. The candidate, in theory, is the leader of a party during the election and until the next election.
Sure.
In theory. Sure. This is the model under which the American political system tends to operate. It doesn't always work that way.
Right. Well, at least the way that the corporate brand parties operate.
Yes. Yeah. Now, the People's Party is very small and has no real grassroots support and is mostly one dude and a bunch of celebrity friends who can exert influence with other people.
Yeah.
That said, they're very well organized. They're not very big, and a lot of their organization is toxic and self-destructive. But the group that controls it and has maintained control is very well organized towards maintaining control and maximizing its influence group.
Sure.
Now, I'm going to go ahead and hit some historical points here, but I'm going to come back to something I talked about earlier and left, which is the Classics Learning Test and the company that runs it. The dude who runs it is a very serious ultra-Catholic. Like I said, Nick Fuentes type Catholic.
Yep.
And the academic board that Cornel West belongs to includes 3 types of people. And if you study the board, you can identify which of these 3 types of people each board member is just by reading the information about them. The first type of person on this board is a white person who is associated with private schools in some way, either the charter movement or specifically the parochial school movement. So group number 1 is school choice grifters. Group number 2 is white Christian nationalists. People like Christopher Rufo, the president of and I'm not making that name up, Christopher Rufo is on the academic advisory board. The president of the Heritage Foundation, a dude who does a podcast about the beauty and truth of Western culture and defends it against a hostile academia, which is to say he's basically doing a Proud Boy broadcast without calling himself a Proud Boy.
Western chauvinism, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Then there is a third group of people. So you've got but that second group is the white supremacist crowd.
Right.
Christian nationalists. So you've got the charter school, you've got the school choice grifters who have a heavy Christian orientation in the first place. And then you've got the Christian nationalists. All of the people in these 2 groups on the board are white.
Yep. And then you have your Black intellectuals.
More than that. It's very specific. Black Christian intellectuals.
Yep. Okay.
I want to specify that.
Yep.
I want to specify that for a reason. There is a tendency in the various Christian ecumenical movements for some of the worst people and some of the best people to sit down and try to hash out their differences under the pretense that they agree on certain Christian principles that they don't actually agree on.
Mm-hmm.
And it is one of the most toxic and pernicious problems in organizing, in that a great many people in the liberal or even socialist movement come out of church movement, of religious movements with reactionary tendencies. A great example is Chris Hedges is a Presbyterian preacher whose views on trans rights and sex workers' rights are questionable.
Yep.
He openly acknowledges working with anti-abortion advocates on issues like the economy and peace without really thinking about how the abortion issue ties into the economy.
Yep.
And why the very people who are opposed to abortion and giving lip service to his economics have no real interest in his economics, because it's the anti-abortion stuff that matters to them. And so we're seeing even around Cornell West this sort of very Christian orientation that comes in West. Jill Stein was one of the people who attended Nick Brana's Rage Against the War Machine rally.
Yep.
As was Matthew Heimbach. I'm glad you mentioned him earlier.
I will. I could do a whole show on Matthew Heimbach.
Matthew Heimbach was invited to the Rage Against the War Machine rally by a man named Caleb Mopan.
So, when I was coaching debate at Towson, Matthew Heimbach was a student there, and the debaters that I were coaching were Black nationalist debaters who managed to be the first Black students to win a national debate championship by calling out the white supremacy of the college debate and academic system. Matthew Heimbach was also on campus and was using the space that was being given to the debate team in order to advocate for Pan-African Black nationalism, and using that space as the wedge in order to be able to get his foot in the door.
Yes.
And his academic advisor was the person whose office was right across from the debate team. And so we're nearing the end here, and we could have a long conversation about Matthew Heimbach. David Rovix is a person who I know.
I don't want to get that far off. I want to keep on the. I want to keep on the people loosely associated with Cornell West. So
go back to your story. We'll talk about Matthew Heimbach on Twitter.
Yes, exactly. But so Heimbach was invited to the Rage Against the War Machine event by a guy named Caleb Mopan, who runs an organization called the Center for Political Innovation. He's a weird guy. When you're a white guy and you openly brag that your one Black friend is Robert Mugabe, it's a little questionable.
Yep.
And when you claim to be a communist and your political hero is Alexander Dugin, that raises some questions too.
It maybe not even. Maybe you don't even need to ask those questions.
Caleb Malpan is also related. I believe he's the nephew of one of the bigwigs in a party in the UK I mentioned before, the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, who are social conservatives who campaign with the economic right instead of the economic left, because social conservatism is what matters to them.
Right.
Caleb Mopan has openly advocated the idea that the working class is fundamentally reactionary and that tailing white supremacists is the way to socialist revolution.
Yep.
which is why he's the one who invited Heimbach. Heimbach was boothing at the CPI's after party for the Rage Against the War Machine event. And the CPI seems to be one of the major organizations that has been sort of onboarding and mainstreaming LaRoucheites into the left. So to get back to Lyndon LaRouche's widow was one of the speakers at the Rage Against the War Machine, and the People's Party is now, and their partners in the Mises Caucus of the Libertarian Party, along with CPI and other groups, are now getting ready to launch another anti-war rally to make even more money off bringing white supremacists and putative progressives together. And it seems interestingly timed to coincide with the West campaign. Again, these are the folks who asked Cornel West to run.
Sure.
And again, he sits on an academic advisory board, which looks very suspiciously like a bunch of white Christians who got a bunch of black Christians to make them respectable. And Cornel West has lent his name to op-eds written by the CEO of this organization, published in mainstream outlets, praising Ron DeSantis on education and making absolutely no mention of the fact that Ron DeSantis has been on a warpath to erase black studies and queer people from education in Florida.
Yep. And look, at the end of the day, I think that the West campaign is going to be highly prominent. It's going to bring a bunch of new people into the party. Some of those people who it's going to bring into the party are going to have views that are not aligned with mine. I think that's actually okay. I think that type of contest within the party and that type of struggle over the apparatus of limited power or whatever it is important. I think it's really valuable work that you're doing on identifying who the players are. But I guess my position on this, whenever people say that they're worried that somebody's going to take over the Green Party, is like, yeah, I have those concerns, and I'm going to fight for the vision of it that I think is necessary. And if we lose it, we lose it. But like, I guess to me, this is what it means to actually have a political party that is trying to participate in a realignment in order to bring about outcomes. You know, it's like we have to have hard political fights. And I think too often we end up being a party of people who are eschewing those fights instead of embracing those fights.
Yes.
And I want a version of the Green Party that is anti-racist, anti-oppression, anti-war, anti-sexism, all of those things, while also constructing a vision that realigns the way and that realigns who the constituencies are that make the decisions in the two-party system. I think with so many people dropping out of the two-party system because neither of the parties are serving them, because they're corporate brands that are there in order to raise money off of opposing each other, I think there's a real risk that the UK Marxist-Leninists are right, that the working class can be crafted into a reactionary force that supports the right. And I think that the fight within the Green Party over the next 18 months and after that is going to be to assert that we are not that we are committed, that there is no throwing social justice under the bus, and that it has to be a part of what this coalition looks like, and it has to be a part of our efforts at this realignment. So, you know, it's like...
Which is why...
Go ahead.
And I'm just going to identify one more player so that people know what's going on, which is why it bothers me a little when Chris Hedges goes on the Jimmy Dore show and says, hey, we don't have to worry. Dr. West isn't into political correctness.
Yep.
Because what does political correctness mean to some of the people that Chris Hedges wants to bring into the movement?
Right.
And now this raises this question that I put on the board here. How do we get the Green nominee in the debates? This is the perfect transition to electoralism. And what are our real chances of making real electoral change right now?
They don't. So I think the opportunity to make real electoral change happens at the state and local level. I think the state is the highest level of abstraction that the Green Party should legitimately be focusing on, because it can talk about things that are really do affect people. I think too much local politics. I think local politics is great, but sometimes there's not enough power vested in those small seats that we fight so hard to win in order to really materially be able to change people's lives and realign things. So I think that I think that the national campaign, sure, go do your thing. And I don't know. I mean, like I said, I'm on team none of the above right now at the national level. I may change my mind at some point, but I need the candidate, the campaign, and the party to show me that this is a good strategic decision instead of more customism, which is what I often think it is. Now, that being said, I think at the state level, we can begin to identify I think at the state level, we can begin to identify a political program that starts to reorient and change and make a new constituency around multi-party democracy as the first part of the process. And it's the second part of the process, a hard left, anti-oppression, anti-racist party being part of it. And so for me, the vision is there are multiple parties and we are one of them and we do our thing really, really well. Now, what I'm going to talk about when I'm running my campaign as it relates to electoralism is, first of all, I would be in a state where there's a deep blue legislature that's not going to want to do anything that I want to do, but we're going to figure out how to use executive power well. We're going to sue the shit out of the corporations that have done a lot of bad stuff to people in Maryland, and we're going to use or at least we would try. But that's one of the things we're going to do. We're going to use the emergency powers of the administrative state here in order to make sure that things like food deserts and the opioid crisis are treated not as things that the legislature gets to just play with. But if the legislature is not willing to act, we're going to do what our governor did during COVID, and we're going to use emergency powers in order to allow the executive agencies to act and act swiftly and decisively. And third thing we're going to do is we're going to push constitutional amendments that give people power over specific things. I think that there's a progressive tendency to push all the power out to the people, and I think that happens within the party as well. And I think what we really need to do is to figure out where the people should have power and where they should have leverage over the people who are in power.
The people, one thing that Atlanta has shown is the people should absolutely have power over whether or not to build a new police training center.
Totally. Absolutely they should. And right now, they may be able to have the power via ballot initiative to stop that. But in Maryland, we don't have citizen initiatives or ballot initiatives at a statewide level. So there's no pathway other than the Democrat supermajority legislature right now. And we need to have a political reorientation and political realignment that allows the left to be able to run candidates that can exert power in a different way. I guess there's a lot that I want to talk about at that level, because I think that level of abstraction, the level of the state, is a level that we can materially do things, but also a level that we can force realignments. I don't think that the party is in a position at this point to force a realignment at the national level. And so I think, circling back to where we started, nationalizing green races traps us answering David Axelrod forever. And it's like that's why until you prove that this is better for me to run Cornell West, or better, not for me, better for the Green Party, better for the people to run Cornell West than it is to not run him. I'm going to be on team none of the above.
Perfect sense.
And I think with competent green campaigns operating at a statewide level, it creates an umbrella that smaller campaigns can run on under that political program. So if over the next 4 years we develop a solid anti-racist, anti-oppression, anti-sexist left program here in Maryland, while we're out there reaching out to those 12,000 people who are Greens or were formerly Greens, we can get them to run for city council, we can get them to run for state delegate, and we can work on a unified, democratically decided political program that advances the issues of the left and fights this tendency of the right and the populists to steal our ideas and strip the materiality of them.
I'm going to make some suggestions because we get forgotten. And I know from Alan, who is a friend of the show that has been busy offline, and I haven't been in touch with him any less. You look at positions like city council, school board, public utilities commissions, county judges, and you get people to run against people who never have to run against anyone.
Right.
You make people defend their records on a local and state and county level. These can really make change with elections immediately. And more importantly, these are the places where we can really actually do harm prevention.
Yeah.
Look at what
Right.
states are doing. Look at what states are doing and what the federal government is not doing to stop them. The reason I put this answer from Gira to Jim's question about getting the Green nominee in the debates up is because this is true. This is the answer. Unfortunately, we don't. Unless there's another alternative candidates debate series again. The DNC crooks have put the kibosh on debates because they're running a zombie. And that's not complete. The last part, the DNC and the Republicans are going to keep third parties out of the debates entirely unless it benefits them somehow.
Yeah.
The reason Ross Perot was in the debates in 1992 was primarily because the media did not like George H.W. Bush and thought that Ross Perot running would be bad for Republicans and their aggressively anti-social social agenda. And they knew that economics was going to be the same no matter who won.
Yep. And, one thing I would say here is
people.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I wanted to finish this thought before we move. What a lot of people don't know, you might, and I know Gira does because she watches the show and was in the chat on a couple times when this was discussed. But in 2012, Jill Stein and Sherry Honkala were arrested and held incommunicado for trying to get into the debates.
Yeah, like I said, very, very good friends with my late friend Kevin Zeese, and this is an issue that we've talked about. We talked about quite a bit, and what it means to get in those debates, what would happen, and what they're going to do to stop it. So let me say one thing on the debate question. In 2018. Well, actually, two things. In 2018, when I ran for state delegate, I made an argument that debate should be mandatory for candidates that are receiving public funds or something like that. Okay, maybe that's probably the case, but people are just going to avoid that by not taking public funds. But as governor, you get to have not unlimited, but some board setting and some agenda setting for Maryland Public Television. And so one of the things that we would do is we would make sure that Maryland Public Television was surfacing the kind of debates that we need to have, not just around elections, but around things like the war. I know we haven't gotten to the war yet, but so much of the discussion about the war is simplified into two really simple answers when there's actually a lot of complexity out there. And what we need to do is we need to give people the ability to learn about that and have agency even over that conversation. And so thinking about how do we direct the public television and media apparatus of the state to make sure that they are spending as much time talking about famous ducks in the state, which I love, don't get me wrong, as they are talking about the really important political questions that people in our state face. So when we got to think, when we're thinking about green campaigns, we got to think about what is the right campaign to do to get the right outcome and build the right movement around it. For me, that's running as an executive, that's running at an executive level, talking about executive power and using that for movement building. For other people who are more connected to really specific issues in their community, people will say to me, why aren't you running for mayor of Baltimore and talking about crime? It's well, because my consumption of crime is as a consumer, whereas I've been working very seriously on multi-party democracy for about 8 or 10 years at this point. And I'm going to run there. I'm going to bring that argument, and then I'm going to use it to highlight things that strategically help us. I think too often, as I said before, we become a home for people who think that power is not something we actually need to think about how to utilize. And we get too focused on voter choice and not on changing outcomes. And if we're going to put this much effort and work into it and money and time and all of that other stuff, we need to be changing outcomes. And we need to be having strategies that allow us to do that.
If the left can't change an outcome at least once in a while, what are we doing?
Right. Right. And if the only outcomes we risk changing are upsetting supermajorities or running electoral campaigns on a president, if the only outcome that we're changing is the presidency.
Let's be totally honest. Let's be totally honest.
Right.
2020 has proven that even a moderately progressive FDR liberal cannot win the Democratic Party nomination in the current political climate.
No.
the media control, the media monopoly in this country. Let's remember, a cartel of a tiny number of corporations owns our media, and all the responsible CEOs in this media construction are billionaires.
Yep.
With deep invested interests in fossil fuels and the military-industrial complex, and all of the things that that are fueling the corporate machine that controls our politics.
Right.
So let's be completely honest. A Green Party candidate is not going to win an election in this country anytime in the next decade. Not for president, not a national election.
No,
Now,
I mean, decade seems super generous to me, and I'm a person who's wearing a Green Party shirt right now.
Well, let's just remember. I mean, one full presidential cycle, 2 terms, and you're gone. And that's 8 years right there. That's most of a decade.
Yep.
There are only 2 presidential elections every decade.
Right.
So you're right. That is generous. But the reason I say a decade is because we hear a lot of talk about how little time I have to action about climate change.
Yep.
So it's important to understand that from a practical, pragmatic perspective, there is zero we can do electorally to change climate outcomes.
Yep.
Now, keeping that in mind, the question becomes,
absolutely.
Well, even on a state level, you would have to be able to. I mean, Delaware is the best example, and I'll use Delaware because it's a blue state, and people would not think of it as being an environmental hellhole, but it is because it's a corporate state.
I live in Maryland, so I know how Delaware is.
Yes, you do. You're close enough to know exactly what I'm talking about. Delaware is an environmental hellhole without simple things like clean air and clean water. And you wouldn't think this about a small, relatively well-off state, but it's true. And just to clean up Delaware, a third party would have to take over, would have to have a supermajority in the legislature to be able to undo all the things that corporate Democrats have done in the century that they've controlled it.
Yep. And or
in Maryland, I'm sure.
Or they would have to be able to wield executive and court power well, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I think if we want to think about what it would take to create the realignment, it would.
Well, let's be honest. Even wielding executive and court power extremely well, there's a strong. I mean, unless Maryland has no mechanism for impeaching a governor.
Yep. So let's be clear, right? Like, that's not going to happen, right? Like, well.
And I'm not trying to, and I'm not saying this because I'm trying to tell anyone not to vote for Andy in 2026. You should absolutely vote for Andy in 2026. What I'm trying to make clear to people is that the electoral approach cannot.
I lost you for a little bit right at the crucial point there. I lost you at the what you're trying to make clear is
the electoral approach cannot be the only approach.
Absolutely.
because barring miracles, and miracles happen, I believe that we need to have revolutionary optimism, and we need to consider that miracles can happen. They've happened before, they'll happen again, but we cannot rely on miracles, and we have to organize, be ready for opportunities, which means we have to be organizing against basic ideas like capitalism and racism and militarism, the stuff that Dr. King was talking about.
Yeah.
Electoral reform, if it comes at some point in the future when a revolutionary action makes it possible. What we forget about the civil rights movement is that the civil rights movement was made possible by a radical UAW that was willing to support Democratic politicians that it agreed with, but was not yet an institution of the Democratic Party. So it was a radical NAACP that was willing to support politicians it agreed with, but was not a political institution of the Democratic Party. Many of the not even many, all of the liberation organizations of the 1960s, except for the most marginalized, which were deliberately marginalized in order to make this possible, are now controlled by duopoly parties.
Totally.
Even the Congress of Racial Equality was transformed into an organ for Reagan Republicans in the 1980s.
Yep. So let me talk about this a little bit, because I think there's a couple of things here. The first is that there's always a tension running as a Green Party candidate about how much you talk about what you're going to do when you win,
yes,
and how much you talk about the organizing goals that you make along the way, right? And so some of this conversation that I'm having right now is what would I do if I win? What does that political science fiction look like? Right. So that's part of it. The second thing is, I think that the party needs to get really clear about what role it plays in a revolutionary movement, and stop trying to play all of the roles in it, and start making itself available as a ballot line to revolutionaries who want to be able to challenge the system based on the work that they've been doing already, and stop thinking that it needs to reconstruct the whole sphere of the movement within its own ecosystem. We need that green ecosystem, but what we need is a party that recognizes that its role is to gain ballot access and allow people who want to use the electoral system as a stage in order to take part in larger organizing projects to be able to do so. And so I think we need to have a real conception of the party that situates itself comparatively to other green parties around the world and historically with other left parties within the United States, to understand how to actually use it to effectively bring about revolutionary goals.
This is tricky because there are different projects that have to be run simultaneously. They have to be run by different groups, because if they're not run by groups, you'll see overlap where people are doing where instead of each group doing what it's supposed to do, you're going to be seeing concentrated power used for one set of goals rather than really seeing everything. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself.
And a good example of this is Hallie Hawkins' Green Socialist Organizing Project.
Yes.
So I really support GSOP. I think it's really the type of ecosystem development that Greens need to be doing, so that there can be political education, there can be community building, there can be resources. But when it started with the same account and the same authority line as the Hallie Hawkins presidential campaign, and tying those two things together made it so that it looked like this was just the outreach organization of the presidential campaign. Even if it wasn't, even if we assume that it was its own independent organization like it is now, having them fused together at the beginning made it look like this was just a part of the campaign. And I think that we need to have campaigns that are related to civic organizations, but are not those organizations.
And it's worth noting that I hear from people who have been paying attention that history is kind of repeating itself. That the professional ballot access guy who isn't even a Green on the Cornel West campaign is being pulled into the Green Party's voter outreach organizing machine, such as it exists, in anticipation of the election, which has the potential to again create the kind of butthurt bad feeling we saw when Howie was steamrolling it because of all these conflicts of interest.
Yep. Like again, this is why
that was the context in which the concern was raised to me. It was it was back to the conspiracy theory, and I understand your skepticism. What does taking over the Greens look like? What does it really mean in the short? Well, but again, they're concerned that this will compromise the actual goals of the Green Party by making the election about the goals of Nick Brana and the People's Party.
Yeah, and I think there's a good chance that happens. I think constituency making within the Green Party is a process that is both easy and hard at the same time. And I think the party itself does too much and too little at the same time in regard to it. And I think there's a risk there. I think people within the party who have a clear vision of it being different need to A, call out that risk, and B, organize in order to make sure that doesn't happen. And if it does happen, we need to know when to cut bait and build something new, right? It can't be, we cannot replicate the cultist way that the two parties keep their people as part of their members. We have to be able to have fluidity amongst parties when our political and our ideological strategies change, and creating fluidity amongst people, making it easy for me to say, you know what, too much Nick Brana, I'm going somewhere else. Like, that has to be a thing that we enable people to do. Otherwise, we're just trying to create a third party and a two-party system, and we can't be doing that. We have to be arguing that there is a multi-party system that needs to exist, and we need to be part of it. Not let us play at your table and let us be like, the third party in your two-party corporate system. We have to think about it differently. We have to allow organizers and voters to leave if they want to, and we have to fight to make it the way that we want it to be.
There are really three focuses, even before you get into the question of whether or not it needs to have a paramilitary wing, which is a whole nother discussion. But there are three basic focuses that absolutely have to be in a revolutionary movement right now. The first, and the absolutely most important, is a cultural project that is predicated on educating, outreach, and building a working class culture that is pro-Black, pro-queer, pro-disabled, pro-indigenous. Straight, simple, few words as possible. That's the cultural project. Then the second project is the revolutionary part of the project. This part really needs to break up into smaller groups, but all those groups need to talk to each other. You need to have an indigenous movement. You need to have clear platforming for a pro-indigenous movement, a pro-environmental movement, a pro-Black movement, a pro-queer movement, a pro-disabled movement. Yeah. All of those groups need to be working both separately and together to build the organizing and non-electoral political action muscle to make that to drive and expand that cultural project, get it out to as many people as possible, and do things with the people who come out educated by that cultural project, so that they can start doing things. And then number three, which in many ways is actually the least important of the three, is the electoral party structure, which actually seeks to take part in electoral politics and work for liberal reform within the system.
Yeah, I mean, the electoral part of it is inherently reformist, right?
Yes.
I think that this is a point that I make that angers people sometimes, but it's like, look, the Green Party is an inherently reformist institution. We are seeking power within the existing structure. We're trying to configure how and who gets elected within it, but it is not a revolutionary project, and that's okay. It can be a complement to a revolutionary project. It can be a tool that revolutionaries can use, but it is very important to make clear, especially as new people get excited and come on in, this is not about burning down the system. It is about building out the system, and it is about reform. It's a reformist project, and I think it can be part of a revolutionary movement. And I think Joel Covell is really good on the ways that the party can be the electoral apparatus of a revolutionary movement. And I think we need to not lose touch with that and think that elections are how the revolution occurs, even if elections are part of a revolutionary ethic and part of a revolutionary culture. We can be a part of it. I have no doubt about that. But we are a reformist part of it that goes into the system and tries to change outcomes using the system.
Harm reduction. Ultimately, and this is an important part of the electoral reform process that is lost in both the New Deal and the Great Society. there were active political groups who were pushing for much more than what the Democrats were willing to give anyone.
Right.
And liberals were forced to do more than they otherwise would have because of this outside pressure.
Yep.
Norman Thomas's Socialist Party was tremendously important in pushing FDR left in a way that other Democrats simply could not do because they were Democrats and FDR had the institutional power in the Democratic Party because he was the president. And the political bosses were pretty much in his pocket, especially by the third term.
Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
And so all the reformism of the New Deal came out of the fact that there was a dedicated political voice for the working class who were being left out of the way things were being done before the New Deal.
Yeah.
The reason the Great Society succeeded is because there were all these black people who were not in any way bound to the Democratic or Republican parties, who were free to vote for people who were willing to protect their interests.
Yeah.
I mean, civil rights was bipartisan, carried out by liberal Republicans and liberal Democrats in opposition to conservative Republicans and conservative Democrats. The New Deal was liberals working together in opposition to conservatives across party lines. You had Roosevelt Republicans, both in the New Deal era and in the World War II era, who were a tremendous part of the electoral coalition.
Yep.
Now, the new system doesn't allow that, which means those influences we have to, in order to change the system, we have to be able to create outside organizations capable of breaking in.
Yep.
And
capable of influencing and breaking in. And I think, the context here reminds me of the discussion I've been having recently about ranked choice voting, right? Like I'm anti-ranked choice voting at this point for the most part. I know that that's probably the most scandalous thing I've said so far today, but I think ranked choice voting is getting co-opted by nonpartisan, non-party type of reformers. And I think Philadelphia is a great example of it, where they're looking to replace a system that dedicates the working class or the working families party a position, or the Republicans a position. They're looking to replace it with RCV and nonpartisan primaries. And I think that we have to be committed to not asking for what they're going to give us and what we think the liberals want to give us and the governing coalitions right now want to give us, but to actually ask for what we want. And for me, that is a multi-party system with multi-member districts, and there are multi-members or multiple parties in that. I mean, again, this goes back to the formulation that I have of the Green Party, which is it can't be just agitators. It can't be a third party on a two-party system. We have to have a multi-party system that captures more of the political spectrum, and the Greens have to be a solid, committed, and focused part of that. And I think that we also need to have an ecosystem of organizations that are feeding candidates into our party, that are participating in our internal democratic processes, and that are out there doing work every single day in the community. We too often, though, I think what we end up doing is thinking that work out there in the community, that organizing work, that base building work, that revolutionary ground and culture work has to be done by the party. And I think that's the mistake, is thinking that the party is somehow in this system going to be able to operate as if it was Cuba or something.
And let's remember that there is also the Mandela problem. And you have to be careful when talking about the Mandela problem, because you never want to say anything that'll make it sound like you're openly advocating for people in a civilized society under the rule of law as agreed on by civilized people in this modern world. But the Mandela problem is real. You have to do something about judges with lifetime appointments. If you want to have if you want to replace a Brett Kavanaugh or a Clarence Thomas, the only way you can replace them is if that seat is vacant. And lifetime appointments mean there's only two ways that seat becomes vacant: retirement and death. And that's why Nelson Mandela was in prison.
Yeah.
And we can never lose sight of the fact that Nelson Mandela was in prison for so long because revolutionary politics requires being willing to deal with the problem of corrupt Nazis with lifetime appointments.
Yep.
At some point, the propaganda of the deed becomes the only way to make a judge's seat vacant. I don't advocate for that, but we are reaching the point where we see the electoral right, not even the hard right, but the electoral right, advocate for violence on a daily basis and engage very publicly in stochastic terrorism against everybody they don't like.
Yeah. Yeah.
Up to including calling the most conservative liberals communists.
Right. Right.
And then the most conservative liberals stand up and applaud when their enemies condemn communism, not understanding that they're applauding their own demise.
Mm-hmm.
And when all of this is factored in, ultimately, at some point, you have to engage, you have to choose your self-defense tactics based on the tactics your enemy is using to attack you. Martin Luther King Jr. had armed bodyguards.
Sure. And so I guess this is where I think that electoral politics is harm reduction.
Yes, exactly.
Where multi-party, where electoral politics and advocacy for multi-party systems is harm reduction, and that's and it's like, you know, I mean,
it's not even at this point, and I hate to use this language, being an anti-capitalist,
yeah,
and a communist, but at this point, it's not even harm reduction. Electoral politics and multi-party systems is a startup that we have to be able to sell to people.
Correct.
People have to be willing to invest in our startup.
Yes.
I hate to use that language.
No, I think that's reasonable language to use at this point, because it has captured so much of the imagination about how organizations and products or whatever come to be. And there is such a product-centered consumer capitalism at this point that it's a helpful frame. And I think I would say at this point is it is a startup that promises harm reduction instead of going down the path that you were talking about, right? And so it's like one of the offers of it is, hey, we're going to end up in a place where judges are getting killed very quickly. And one of the off-ramps to that is to embrace an electoral politics within, and like most startups, it's making big, audacious promises that are going to be difficult to deliver on.
Let's remember that, and I don't want to defend Democrats too much. I don't want to defend cops too much. I don't want to defend the carceral system too much. But let's remember that a few years back, a quiet story that sort of got shuffled under the rug was that there was a hit attempt on a moderately liberal judge who was attempting to regulate business, and someone killed her family trying to get her.
Yeah. And so I think that's a good point. We're already in the place where that kind of violence is happening. And I guess, you know, it's like, if we think about how the collapse occurs, the collapse does not occur with Thanos, you know, snapping his fingers and half the people disappearing. It happens when fire burns down your neighborhood and there's no way to rebuild it.
Let's remember.
It happens when judges get killed. It happens when things like that are already happening around us.
Let's remember, too, that Thanos snapping his fingers was not the central problem at the center of those two Avengers movies.
Right.
The central problem at the center of those two Avengers movies was that Thanos correctly saw a large number of problems in many of the same ways that correctly see those problems now. Yeah. And then half the population, those problems will be solved. Now, when you look at it that way, then you start to see that Thanos, rather than being the central problem, Thanos is the solution to those problems. And solving the problem of Thanos does not solve all those other problems. It just gets fascism off your back so you can work on them again.
Right. And I guess, to me, that is the lane of third-party electoral politics. That is the hope at its best actualization, is that it helps other folks who are doing good work to be able to have less pressure from the two-party system in order to do that work. So it's interesting. Like, I will say this. I think it's important to emphasize this for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's important to have the clarity within the movement that we are not doing revolutionary politics. We may be adjacent, we may be supportive, but right now we are engaged in a reform project that's aim and end is harm reduction. It's an important reform project and it's an important harm reduction, and it does help other things to happen. But we could win a constitutional amendment in Maryland tomorrow that said that there was a multi-party system and have 5 parties in the legislature. And if there is not a culture building and a political building apparatus outside of the party, then it's just going to be 5 instead of 2. I think that the 5 makes it easier to put brakes on some of the fascist escalation, but I don't think that it should be seen as a solution unto itself, and nor do I believe that Cornel West getting 5% means that the revolution is here and we can give up on the rest of it. It would be great if he got 5%. It would enable something. Maybe we can go back and forth on that, but it would enable some things to happen and it would allow some building to occur. But that building has to be ready to occur regardless of what percentage he gets in the election. And we have to have an honest and sober assessment of what it is that the extent of what we can do with that is. And so this goes back to the point that I was making earlier, that is, I think if the Greens are going to play in electoral politics, we have to think about how to build power and utilize that power in order to get outcomes that are in line with our values. And if we can keep that concept at the core of what we're doing, I think it helps us to limit what we describe we can do. And I think it helps us to give possibility of what we can achieve.
And I think that's well put. The reason I put this comment on the board, a lot of young people like Bernie are right for the Green Party following, is turn people against that of sort of magical. The idea that Bernie Sanders following is somehow a movement for future change is extremely enticing and has largely debunked itself since 2021. What we've seen since 2020, starting in 2021, not very long after, well, even before 2021, starting not very long after even before the January 6th, starting not very long after Congress was ready to take its seat, you started to see a whole lot of stuff play out inside the Democratic Party and inside what we had thought during the election was the Bernie movement. And what people found out is there wasn't a Bernie movement, there were 2 campaigns. And there were people who were connected with these political campaigns for a variety of reasons. But ultimately, what it came down to is that something about Bernie's personality spoke to them and their agendas more than they were really grabbing onto Bernie's agenda. Which is not to say that Bernie's agenda was bad, or that Bernie's agenda didn't offer a lot. But it's important to understand that Bernie's agenda was a compromise between a lot of different input groups and was ultimately still, in the end, not much different than what the Democratic Party was offering outside of Bernie, and was completely opposed by even the most progressive forces within the Democratic Party that should have been Bernie's allies, right, because they don't consider Bernie a member of their club.
Yeah.
And with all that in mind, and with the fact that a lot of specific state electoral results in 2016, in retrospect, were Trump Republicans trying to stop Hillary without really much thought into whether they really supported Bernie, and that a lot of the people who supported Bernie in 2020 were cheerleading Kyle Rittenhouse because of fires set in Kenosha, shows how the Bernie campaign, while it brought a lot of people together, really wasn't a movement that unified those people beyond anything other than supporting Bernie.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of truth to that, and I think that it shows the possibilities and limits of campaigns as vehicles of changing, of vehicles of realignment,
especially the Democratic primary campaign, and you just into the Democratic nominee at the end.
Yeah.
As nothing demoralized and divided the so-called Bernie movement after the nomination of Biden than Bernie endorsing and campaigning for Joe. Yeah. And then you have the division where a bunch of Bernie people who now support Joe start going out of their way to bully and attack and intimidate Bernie people advocating against both Joe and Trump, and actually trying to talk about revolutionary possibilities for the future that have nothing to do with the immediate political question in front of us, to just say, no, it's too important to stop Trump. And I'm an old guy now. I've been watching elections for a while. We've got to stop Ronald Reagan. We've got to stop Poppy Bush. We've got to stop W. I mean, we had to elect Clinton because even though Bob Dole himself wasn't necessarily so horrific, Bob Dole had openly stood up and embraced the very elements of the Republican Party that he and Barry Goldwater had been opposing in the 1980s at the 1992 Republican Convention. And so we were told, well, we have to vote for Clinton to stop the Republicans because Dole's not so bad, but look at these people around Dole.
Yeah. Look, trying to start the movement via a nationalized two-party election is probably a shortcut that is more damaging than it is helpful. And I think that we need to, and one thing I think about a lot of times when we think about the role that Greens play in some of those elections is, okay, fine, like that. We agree that those votes didn't belong to Hillary Clinton or whatever. But what do we get for voting for Jill Stein in 2016? What happened as a result of that? Did it help the movement grow? Did it help the party grow? Or was it just playing that game that they've set up for us? And I would say it's a little bit of a lot of good Greens came in 2016. So I wouldn't say that we got nothing out of it. I think that the party got a big jolt of new life. I think it got a bunch of new young folks joining. I think it got a lot of things, but I don't think it was in a position to grow and build as a result of those gains. And I worry that we're going to be in that same place again in 2024, that we're going to get a lot of people very excited and they're going to show up at their local Green Party meeting. And that local Green Party meeting is not going to be able to match that excitement with its organizational capacity. And people are going to be like, what the hell? And because that's what happened in 2016. And I think the Cornel West is setting us up for another one of those. So I think if you're a Green out there and you're thinking about what you want to do about this, support Cornel West, support none of the above, I don't care. But be ready for those folks who got excited by this, which is the only advantage we say it has, is that it gets people excited. be ready for those people to come organize with you and understand how you're going to meet their energy and understand how we're going to work together to build a movement out of this. Because otherwise, we're going to go out there, we're going to run this race, we're going to piss off a bunch of Democrats, which fine, who cares? But if we can't get anything on the other side of it, then why is it worth it for us, right? And that's ultimately like how I see this, is that we know Cornel. I don't think Cornel West is going to be president. Some people might find that blasphemous for me to say, but I'm a student of history and of political science, and I feel pretty confident that the next president of the United States is not going to be Cornel West. That doesn't mean he shouldn't run, but we as a party should have a strategy and an understanding to develop how this helps us progress the movement, progress the goals that we're trying to work on, and helps us to build a political program that we can get people behind.
My feeling, since you brought it up, my feeling is that Joe Biden has the stink of Benjamin Harrison on his carcass.
Yeah.
And that Trump is off like Grover Cleveland right now. Historically, the reason the weird Cleveland swap out happened is because Grover Cleveland was elected to office on a lot of promises to make life better for ordinary Americans, and ended up sending the army to help break a rail strike.
Right.
And then Benjamin Harrison beat Grover Cleveland with a lot of promises to make things better, and then called out the army to break a mining strike. And then Grover Cleveland was elected again.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's really the ultimate joke and warning of American electoral politics. There are always these periods where the parties are so hard to distinguish from one another. And we're in one of those periods now, just like the Gilded Age. The parties are so hard to distinguish from one another that it almost doesn't matter who's president. And that's where we are right now. That's why we've seen, even though the rhetoric is different, it's why we've seen all the same policies on the border and China. And even though Trump's rhetoric personally was different, all the same Ukraine policies.
And yet we're hyperpolarized. So we're in this weird space where people are taking party affiliation as identity.
Well, it was like that like that or worse in the Cleveland Harrison era. Totally. I mean,
and that's why I think you have a good example there. Because I think
being a member of the Democratic Party who was in good with the local folks in your machine was the social welfare system of the day.
Right.
Where people were taken care of by the local arm of the Democratic Party machine so that they would vote for Democratic politicians.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I think you bring up a good comparison on it. And I guess where I am right now is it feels so tantalizing for us to run an exciting candidate in that mix. And I understand why people are excited about it. And I understand why long-term Greens and new Greens are just thrilled as can be about it. And I think you've raised some good questions about what's actually going on there. And I think that I'm trying to raise some questions about, like, what do we do as a party with this candidacy? And if we don't have answers to those questions, if we don't have answers to what is actually going on here and how do we use this in order to build power, in order to get the outcomes that we want, I think we are setting ourselves up for a potential letdown, disappointment on one side, and then a whole bunch of bad negative energy directed at us on the other side.
I have to agree. I think that's a good place for us to stop our portion of the conversation. I think that's the perfect end note.
Excellent.
Well, I want to thank you for your time. I'm going to do a little bit of a monologue on when we're done that's only tangentially related to what we've been talking about, but which I think is important based on on some of the things specifically we've been talking about. But I want to thank you for joining us. Do you have anything that you want to promote before we let you go? Is there a website people should check out? Is there an account people should follow?
Sure. So you can follow me on Twitter at gogreen2026.com. And then the website is gogreen2026.com. Those are my campaign accounts. You'll see my campaign Twitter and my personal Twitter interacting. I'm trying to draw a line between the two of them. But right now that's the place to follow me. And I would say that we're in the early stages of this. So we're trying to put stuff together right now that allows there to be some things, but we're trying to build it out over the next 18 months as we talk to Greens around the state and around the country. And then we're ready to hit the ground running in 2025 and 2026 so we can have a full 2 years campaigning for the gubernatorial race. I think we've had some good conversation here about the reality of what that's going to be like and the possibility of what that's going to be like. And I'm really excited to have the opportunity to have talked to you about it today, and hopefully we can have more of these conversations. It was a great Sunday for me.
It was a great Sunday for me too. I really appreciate your time. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday and have a great week.
Excellent.
Andy Ellis, thank you very much for joining us today. Folks, interact with Andy if you're on Twitter. Follow the campaign and be part of conversations. We need to educate people as much as we can, and we need to share the conversations we're having to bring more people into them. So on that note, Andy, I want to wish you good luck. I want to thank you for joining me, and I hope you have a great week this week.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you. And folks, on that note, I want to go ahead and give my little monologue here now, which is, since the 1980s, so most of my life now, we have lived in a society where there has been an attack on subcultures by reactionary forces. For lack of a better word, Nazis. This has happened in music, punk music and heavy metal. This has happened in weird hobbies, from comic books to video games to furries. We have seen reactionary attacks to take over subcultures. This is why everybody who's been involved in furry or kink culture can tell a Nazi furry or a Nazi top story. Why lots of people in punk music and heavy metal have I found out my favorite band was a Nazi story. And these things are actually an issue. And we are seeing these attacks in political subcultures now, because so many people who were involved in other subcultures are also involved in political subcultures. Right now, the left is a political subculture. Revolutionary politics is a political subculture. We are seeing attacks on that subculture just as other subcultures have been infiltrated and attacked. The Nazis are trying to put their brand on revolution. There was a show in the 1980s, American Dissident Voices, that sounded like it should have been a communist show, but it was hosted by a Nazi who was talking about white supremacy and how white people were being oppressed. And he was doing it in the language of revolutionary politics and dissidents. And we have to watch out for this. The Cornel West campaign is an opportunity for these forces. They have to be opposed. And it is an opportunity for us to have that fight in public and to win. We need to be prepared to do that, to control, to keep our spaces and to bring people into our spaces instead of these Nazi spaces that are priming them to infiltrate us. We can do this. This is something we can do if we are willing to educate and gatekeep instead of assume that everyone who says they're an ally really is. We have to use some discretion before we're ready to really grow. And that means winning this fight. I want to thank everybody for this week. Keep speaking up, keep speaking out, keep trying to educate, keep trying to talk to people, keep trying to share good ideas and good conversations. I hope everybody has a great week this week. I have a great show lined up next week with filmmaker Matthew Solomon and friend of the show and activist educator Renee Johnston to talk about abolition and Matthew's book and movie, his movie, Reimagining Safety. I think it's going to be as good a conversation as this one was this week. And until then, I'll tweet at you. Everybody take care.